Sustainable Development Policy Institute, STPI, I welcome you all to the evening plenary titled The Importance of Sustainable Development Goals for National Security in the Context of Current Regional Development. Before giving the floor to our Executive Director, Dr. Abid Suleri, let me formally welcome and introduce our esteemed guest, Dr. Moeed Yusuf. Dr. Moeed Yusuf is the Special Assistant to the Prime Minister on National Security Division and Strategic Planning National Security Advisor. Yes, sir. Your Excellency, we have the honor to have you. Now I will give floor to Executive Director, Dr. Abid Suleri, to deliver welcome remarks and start the proceeding of the conversation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Yusuf. We'll try to remain bilingual. Of course, we have guests from foreign missions here, and there are many who are following you on our Zoom link, on our Facebook, and on our STTV. But of course, for the benefit of some of the audience, we can also switch to Urdu as well. So this is the final day, rather final hours of our 24th Annual Sustainable Development Conference. And the theme this year is Beyond Pandemic, Leaving No One Behind. And when we were thinking of organizing this conference, at that time, perhaps we hadn't thought that in this region, there would be a whole country of 40 million people that will be left behind if we don't take our actions in time. So today, while we are concluding this conference, we thought that we should have a conversation with the Western diplomats based in Islamabad. So in this morning, we had a very vibrant session where we had country director of World Bank Afghanistan, we had country director of World Food Program, we have a Canadian High Commissioner, and we were discussing some of the implications of the recent developments in Afghanistan on people of Afghanistan. Now we have you with us, and after you, we will be joined by Chinese Embassy and SAPM on CPEC to discuss the impact of Afghan situation on CPEC. But in order to start our conversation, and अगर आपके हो गए cameras ठीक तो please बैठ जाएंगे. Then, so in order to start this conversation, let me come straight to the topic. And the topic is this: when Western media is trying to turn Pakistan as a scapegoat of what happened in Afghanistan, is it due to our diplomatic failure? Is it due to our economic dependence on West? Or is it simply because West requires an excuse for what the Afghan government, the Ashraf Ghani's government surrendered?
Thank you, Doctor. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It is truly homecoming because I don't know many people if they know or not, probably not, but I started my career in Pakistan, at least with STPI after I came back. So it is always a pleasure. Look, I mean, I think there could be multiple reasons, but the bottom line is there was a strategy employed in Afghanistan that we felt was always a failing strategy. That, just because I say so doesn't really necessarily mean that the other side would believe it. And that's exactly what happened. We had seen Afghanistan over centuries. We have an experience. The outsiders who came there did not. And so our argument throughout was you need to resolve this politically as soon as possible. Their view was total victory, military victory is possible. And that's, I think, where the disconnect is. That disconnect continued to generate frustration in Washington and other capitals, because the argument was if Pakistan could do more, we would get a different outcome. Our point was, first of all, you will not get a different outcome because there's a structural problem. Afghans will not tolerate an outsider as a benefactor. They will always see you as an invader or as an occupier. The other issue, frankly, in this case was when you ask Pakistan to do more, a country that was having bomb blasts every day, a country that was losing hundreds of civilians and soldiers, is Pakistani life worth nothing. You have 80,000 casualties. How many more do you want before you will trust Pakistan to be sincere? So that's a conscious decision, the right decision, I believe. I wasn't in the system, but why should Pakistani lives be wasted on something which would not change the outcome of the war at all? Let me also say that the world blames Pakistan for a double game all the time. There was a double game in this 20 years, but the double game was that Pakistan overnight took a U-turn in support of the US, got a backlash, lost thousands of soldiers and civilians, and what we got for that in return was that Pakistani militants were sitting in Afghanistan and attacking Pakistan under the protection of the Afghan intelligence forces and the support of the Indians. That's really the double game that we talk about. But all said and done, I think this is all irrelevant at this moment. The real question is, you've got 35 to 40 million people facing a winter where millions are going to starve. The UNDPs of the world, the World Food Programs, the World Banks are all putting out data that is shocking. I just yesterday was quoting UNDP's Afghanistan director, I believe, has said that this is the worst humanitarian and economic disaster we've ever seen, or something like that. Nearly universal poverty. What has happened to the champions of human rights and human existence, frankly? Where are they? Because what is happening is that we are almost guaranteeing a humanitarian crisis and meltdown in Afghanistan. So that's where we are, and that's why we've been pushing the entire world to try and see the urgency of the situation and at least let the humanitarian assistance be exempted from all politics.
Thank you, Moeed. But with this policy, what one can see that FATF is trying to now arm twisters. IMF is quite strict on its conditionalities. So don't you think that a policy that we have adopted, and I agree with your ideology and the principle, but it does have an economic backlash on us. So just for the audience who are present here, the last IMF program under the previous government was the first program that was completed by Pakistan out of 21. And it was completed with 16 waivers from IMF. Today, IMF is not willing to let us change any comma or full stop. And if I try to relate, I can immediately relate them with the editorials of Bloomberg and the articles in Economist and all other American very prestigious their publications, where they have suggested President Biden that IMF should take very strict position against Pakistan because it is Pakistan's fault.
I mean, now even formally in documents, you see that the voting patterns of these organizations should be linked to foreign policy interests. So clearly, I mean, we are not saying it, the political angle is there. That said, at this point, the question of Afghanistan is not linked to Pakistan's package with IMF. The real issue very simply is money is not getting into Afghanistan because banking channels are not functioning. There is a very simple solution to allowing banking channels to function, but that is not being implemented. There are exemptions on humanitarian assistance already. It's not under sanctions. Yet no banks are being allowed to, or no banks are willing to conduct transactions. So if there are no transactions, mujhe nahi chahiye, thank you. If there are no transactions, then how do you expect the humanitarian organizations to function? Now, the argument given is, well, we don't know where this money will go, which is, it's just illogical because Pakistan is not saying give us money. No other is the UN, ICRC, World Food Program. Those organizations cannot run their bank accounts. So if they are not trustworthy, then I don't know who is. Basically, this politics will go on. The winter is here, and we are headed for a situation where, frankly, I'm sorry to say, had this been any other country where there was more interest of the powers that be, you would never allow something like this to happen.
But in this global politics, if one can relate it with some of the other examples where those conflict-affected countries, those were provided humanitarian assistance. We have Yemen as an example where Houthis, they are the de facto rulers. We know Libya, Iran, Sudan. So many of such countries at least there were channels for providing humanitarian assistance. So why to treat Afghanistan differently?
You know, channels are there. If you ask those who are preventing, they will tell you that there are formal exemptions that have been given for humanitarian assistance. Correct. But the issue is there are conditions. For instance, no bank is able to guarantee where the end last penny of this donation or assistance is going. Of course, they are not going to do that. So there are certain things that have to be done to really allow it versus just say that they're allowed. Those things are not being done. Our problem is, frankly, that we don't have the kind of resources to support the Afghan population. But if things go wrong there, we are the first ones who are going to be harmed.
And you mentioned about this refugee influx that we may be hosting refugees after this winter. So what sort of implications do you foresee if we have 500,000 to 1 million?
Frankly, at this point, our policy is that we cannot take any more refugees because we already have the kind of economic situation. And, you know, Pakistan, there's been no country more generous than Pakistan. The point we are making is not what will happen after the winter. The point we are making is that anybody who is willing to talk about managing refugees is making a very unethical and immoral argument. The conversation in the world should only be how to prevent even a single Afghan from becoming a refugee again. You know, it's one of the proudest nations on earth. Who wants to leave their country under duress? So, you know, this, I keep hearing this conversation. So Pakistan should prepare to manage refugees. Whether Pakistan prepares or not is our problem. The real issue is how can we talk about this rather than focusing entirely on preventing another refugee crisis? And the way to do that is to allow humanitarian and, frankly, assistance that goes beyond humanitarian assistance. No country can function just on humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, this morning, the country director of World Food Program, he was very blunt in saying that humanitarian crisis is this humanitarian aid provision is a must there. But even if you allow the banking channel transfers, etc., do you think they have enough infrastructure? If the civil servants, they are not getting any salaries, they are not getting any payments. So who will be actual implementer through whom this whole international humanitarian assistance would be distributed?
No, I take your point. You know, the thing is, right now we are just trying to find a very imperfect way to get some assistance in so that you don't have a total collapse. You don't have people literally dying of starvation. You know, the stories that have come out of women selling their children are not Pakistani stories, Western press covering it. And yet everybody is covering it with a straight face with no real, emotion attached to it. I don't know what to say because the irony is that when I speak like this, when people talk like this, then we are blamed for being spokesperson of the Taliban. This has nothing to do with the Afghan government. There are Afghans who also are human beings who are going to die. Somebody needs to look at this. We don't have the resources, and that's why we're championing this cause with the world. So far, I have to tell you, there's a lot more talk than action.
You see, when Taliban they took over, we saw them, their representatives meeting with the Chinese senior leadership, and at that time, China was publicly announcing to support people of Afghanistan, not recognizing Taliban, but at least support people of Afghanistan. And now one can see that there is even some sort of silence from China as well. We will be discussing it in our next session when the Chinese representative come here. But who is standing with Pakistan? Is Pakistan the only country who is taking all the pain?
The issue, Dr. Saab, is not taking the pain or standing up. The issue is, let's say China or any other country, Russia, Middle East, whatever. They have pledged support. Even the EU and US have pledged support. But how should that support get to Afghanistan? The real issue is, I say I want to give $100. But I also know that if I give $100, tomorrow somebody will come and say, oh, the last dollar actually went to the Taliban government, thus you are sanctioned. It's basically a sword hanging over everybody's head. As I told you, if there's real will to make this happen, it's no issue. So far, politics is dictating the way this is going.
And we know that an OIC meeting is also in the planning. So do you think that OIC countries, they would be able to put enough influence on rest of the world to make it happen?
I think that's going to be more long-term, frankly. The conversation there and whether, what there's going to be some OIC funding through what mechanism, that's really going to be about reconstruction, rehabilitation. These next 2-3 months, I mean, we are in the winter. It's December. I mean, Afghan winter. So, no, I mean, I think that's really which is also critical. That's a long-term issue or a medium-term issue. Right now, pledges are there, humanitarian organizations are ready. Pakistan has offered to become the land and air bridge. We are making special dispensation for organizations who want to work from here and send humanitarian assistance there. But then again, when they come and say they can't operate banks, we can't do anything about it.
And that brings me to another point, and it is TTP. Of course, one can follow different rumors coming and different news coming in mainstream media as well as on social media. So has the new Taliban regime, they have given some sort of assurance to Pakistan that they will not let any organization work against interest of Pakistan from Afghanistan?
Dr. Nobody can give any assurance or guarantee, right? I mean, basically the point is I think there's too much media hype about this, but Pakistan's position as a state has always been if there is a way to ensure every Pakistani citizen's safety, if there is a way to ensure there is not blood spilled beyond what has happened, we will attempt that and try that. That's about it. I mean, we have already made it very clear that any third country territory, it will not be acceptable to us for that to be used against Pakistan. It was used for the past 20 years. There's a different situation now. So we'll see where we go. But at the end of the day, what is fair to say is that the real supply line and the support base for the TTP was India and the Afghan intelligence. That for now is not there.
So do you think now we are in a situation where if we have to negotiate with TTP, we will be able to negotiate from more powerful?
We're definitely in a position of strength, but what happens and whether we do it and how, I think it's too premature. We'll see when we get there.
And there is another positive development, and that is Pakistan allowed Indian wheat to be supplied to Afghanistan, which I think is a beginning of ice melting in the region. So why don't Pakistan and other SAARC countries, they sit together? Afghanistan is a member of SAARC. So we know that there was this SAARC head of state meeting when COVID started. India took this initiative. So is Pakistan now de facto presidency of SAARC whenever the next meeting would happen, that would happen in Pakistan, is thinking of taking such initiative?
I'm not aware, frankly. I mean, it's a good point worth considering. I'm actually not aware if at this point we are not, but I'm not aware if there's any planning on this. I haven't heard of this.
And that brings me to another important aspect before I open the floor for a question from the audience. You see, extremism is now very increasingly haunting Pakistan. Few days ago, the incidents in Sialkot, it was the most horrific incidents that put the whole nation to shame. So there's a school of thought which says that due to Talibanization in Afghanistan, some of the militant organizations in Pakistan, they are also getting their strength and they are becoming more vocal, they are becoming more proactive and taking such measures, the followers of them are the organization. So your comments on it?
Again, Dr. Saab, the point is, if you have a particular ideology, you think that now this will bolster your space. Maybe there are organizations who are thinking of this. Maybe there are those who think they'll find a greater bang for the buck, as you say. There's no comparison. I mean, the Pakistani state, we went through such a difficult time. I can assure you, alhamdulillah, there's no worry about any resurgence of terrorism. The kind of apparatus, the kind of capability, the kind of effort that's gone into that, that's not an issue. But I am a big believer of in introspection. If we are unable to look at our own weaknesses and mistakes, and we just convince ourselves that nothing is wrong, we will not fix the problem. Whether you call it extremism or whatever, the word I always use is intolerance. I mean, extremism is loaded, but frankly, Intolerance can be in any form. It doesn't have to be violent. What we really need to work on as a society is this issue of intolerance. If we don't address this, then sometimes you will see manifestation in violence, and some of that will be as horrific as it was. The commitment from the Prime Minister and the government is very clear. The state has to establish its writ in a way that the monopoly over violence is not challenged. We are not there yet. It is challenged sometimes. We have to get there, right? So there's no point saying, everything is fine. We have to work on this. There's the education curriculum, there's civics, there's citizenry, and then there are groups who cross the line that have to be dealt with either through court of law or whatever the process may be. We have to work on this in a concerted fashion. It is not enough for me to sit here and tell you, yes, we know what we have to do. Even if we know what we have to do, a whole of nation approach is needed. This is not my ministry or Moeed, Yusuf or SDPI who can do it. The entire nation has to stand up. We have to come together and make sure that this is tabooed in a way that nobody even dreams of taking matters into their own hands and being violent, no matter in what condition and in what situation.
Dr. Yusuf, then some of the decisions that were taken most recently, and I'm referring to TLP, don't you think that compromising with them once they had killed more than 8 law enforcement officers, it was some bad judgment on part of government?
The optics are complicated. I'll acknowledge that. If you sit outside and you look at that, you're like, okay, so what is the state doing? Here I am telling you writ of the state on the other hand. The easiest thing for states to do is use force. Nobody can stand in front of the strength of the state in terms of brute power. Why do I say it's the easiest thing? Because the alternative is much tougher. States must think long term. If I would have done what you are alluding to as the state 2-3 weeks ago, for 2 days you would have said the state has stood up, and then you would have said, actually, we made a mistake, right? I'll give you the example of Lal Masjid. The entire media nation was saying, this, what is the state doing? And the day the state did what it did, the entire media was saying, look at the state. So you have to think through all of these angles. Sometimes the solutions are very difficult, but there has to be a long-term sustenance to your policy. And I think that's the choice we took, and inshallah you will see the results going forward. That said, let me also say, a lot of people asked me, I'd actually tweeted about this. The state is responsible for every single official. So the policemen who were martyred are the state's responsibility. And that is why this decision becomes so difficult. When 5 or 7 or 8 of your own have fallen, how can you let the other side go? And yet, the state has to make a decision to ensure that in the larger interest of the people, we get to a policy, a strategy, and an outcome where the problem is resolved permanently in a sustained manner. Now, if it's not, then I think you can come back and ask me, but that's where we are going with this. And yes, the optics are complicated, but frankly, mature governments and states should not focus on how we look. We have to see what is in the best interest of the country.
The media friends have asked me to ask you to give your 4 or 5 minute briefing in Urdu as well. But my last question, and then I'll open the floor for a couple of questions. You see, the common perception is that last time when we helped the Afghan people, we couldn't win their trust. So those who were bred and born in Pakistan for decades, when they went back, they thought that Pakistan was betraying them. So how to win the hearts of people of Afghanistan, for whom Pakistan is on the front line for last 4 decades at least?
Complicated. The first thing is, last 20 years, there were millions of dollars poured into creating an anti-Pakistan narrative in Kabul through support of some of the other countries in the region. Why? Because if there wasn't a scapegoat, then questions would have been asked about the corruption, the incompetence, the rotten nature of the Afghan government and the way they were running the state. That, of course, would have led the Western taxpayers to ask their governments on why you're putting in this money. So the easiest thing was, but for Pakistan, everything would be fine. Why did everybody buy that? Because it suited everybody, starting from the Western governments to those who were contracted in Afghanistan and making a lot of money, to the Afghan government and to their cronies who were making all the decisions and the rent seeking that went with it. I mean, just look at what the Western commentary on Afghan governments is now. When we were saying this, we were the villains. So that's the reason for that. People to people, it's different. But if there have been mistakes made here in terms of policy, in terms of not having as much focus on winning hearts and minds, we also need to look at that, right? But our position is very clear. Whoever is in Afghanistan is a brother and sister. We want to work with them as a neighboring country. The refugees and the concessions is no favor. And we have to be clear about this. Sometimes we, present it as a favor. It's not a favor. We want to secure ourselves. For our security, Afghanistan security is non-negotiable. That's why we do it. And yes, there's a cultural bond, there's an ethnic bond, there's a brotherly and sisterly bond, and we'll continue to do it.
But if we are not able to find any doable, feasible mechanism of transferring international pledges there, so what's the way forward to avoid this humanitarian crisis?
It's a question that keeps me up at night, and I'm sorry I don't have an answer for you. We are doing everything we can. Land and air bridge, we've pledged about $30 million. We've waived off duties and sales tax on virtually all important Afghan exports. Some commodities are being traded in rupees. We basically relaxed every single rule in the book. I have to tell you, every morning, the leadership of Pakistan, I myself am sitting there, others from all ministries sit for hours every morning trying to figure out how we can facilitate the situation on the other side. But the fact of the matter is we don't have the kind of money which will be the make or break for this.
So even if we get the money, will we be able to transfer it?
At this point, no. But we are not asking for any money. Keep in mind, we are not saying that Pakistan should get the money. We are saying use our territory to channel whatever support you want through the UN, through the ICRC. We are not involved in the finances. Even the UN and ICRCs of the world are not allowed to use their bank accounts. That's the problem. There's no liquidity in Afghanistan. We have to understand the problem is there's no cash. So I can go to the ATM machine, but where am I going to get the money from? That's the problem. So how do you get actual cash into the country? No mechanism.
Thank you, Moeed.